Good afternoon. It's marvelous to be here with such a panel of distinguished guests, and I would very much like to thank the sponsors for putting on such a wonderful conference. So the agenda for this conference changed a couple weeks ago, and as some of us have already mentioned, we had some other presentations planned for you, and I have one here. There's one printed in your booklet. Don't worry, I will not be trying to squeeze in 40 slides in the next 10 minutes. I'll just extract a couple of them. And so, as was just mentioned, the ITC, the U.S. International Trade Commission, did a comprehensive assessment of the TPP agreement. And the reason it had to be a comprehensive assessment, it ran to over 700 pages, is that the agreement itself is so comprehensive. It has tariffs, rules of origin, customs facilitation, SPS, TBT, intellectual property, government procurement. The list goes on, and it runs to, as we heard earlier, 30 chapters. And part of what we did in the report was, as you see there on the screen, we were able to quantify some of those elements, but not all of them. And largely this has to do with what the economic profession itself can do. And so I will be talking today actually a little bit about where the economic profession is and what light it can bring to some of the questions that are new in the trade debate and in the trade policy debate, and where we need to go to sort of answer some of the questions that have come up. And as you can see here, in our report, we focused on a few areas. The CGE analysis, the modeling, was limited to tariffs, TRQs, and NTMs on a select number of goods, particularly motor vehicles. We did some new work on non-tariff measures in cross-border services trade, and we did FDI provisions that affect investment. And even that list right there is new for us, if not new for the profession. Services, non-tariff measures are hard to quantify and often not quantified until fairly recently. And even more so, FDI barriers are not often quantified in a way that lets you assess their overall effect on one economy, much less another economy halfway around the world. Now I'm going to skip over all of the discussions. Oops, go back to one. We just heard about the spaghetti bowl. There's the spaghetti bowl within TPP itself. 42 of 66 bilateral pairs already are covered by FTAs, but that's just supporting what we just heard. Skipping over how we found all of these results, just wanted to give you a sense of what we found. Looked over the next 15 years. It takes 15 years for many of these provisions to phase in. We had a baseline for the US and the global economies going forward about 15 years, and we said how much would TPP push us away from that baseline. And here's sort of the headline numbers. US real income would go up about 0.2%, excuse me. In the next 15 years, a little bit more after that when some of the other provisions phase in. Real GDP would go about the same, employment would rise but very modestly, and capital stock would rise as well. So yes, we find gains to the US economy, they're fairly modest. If you look in a little more detail, you can take a look at the output column there, how outputs would be affected in the United States. You'll see that agriculture and food has the biggest change, and that's because for the new TPP partners, agriculture and food barriers are the highest. Services has a small positive increase, so services would grow a little faster than the baseline with TPP. Only 0.1% faster, but services is such a big part of the economy that would add $42 billion to the US economy every year. And you see a slight decline in manufacturing relative to where it would be, so slightly slower growth in US manufacturing relative to where it would be in 15 years. And that's not because the agreement is bad for US manufacturing, but because endowments in the United States are limited, we only have so many resources, and if resources are diverted into agriculture, food, and services, then some of them naturally will be leaving manufacturing. Okay, so there's a lot more in the report. It runs many, and you see some in your booklet. I'm not going to go through it. But we've got very detailed results by very detailed industries. We looked at about 100 different industries. And then in addition to that, we have detailed results by industry, by training partner, where that was worthwhile. And we made an attempt to discuss policy-relevant topics. Effects on workers, which is a big part of the trade debate. effects on profits in multinationals, effects on the trade balance. But the elements in the current trade debate go beyond that. They're going to require new analytical approaches in areas that either the economics profession has only just found answers to, or in some cases where the economic profession hasn't even begun answering. And I have a couple areas that I had come up with in advance, and then I will skip back and talk about some of the areas that my colleague Simon Lesdorf came up with, different ones, but also equally hard to address in economics these days. And so I actually am in charge of economics in an agency that exists to do this type of modeling. I'm assuming many of you aren't, right? So I know why I'm interested in this, but why should you be interested in what we need to do to model these new areas? And I think if we can't analyze these areas, if we can't come up with good answers to them, then the trade debate goes on without good information. And so one thing I want to motivate is a sense that really getting a better understanding of some of these areas helps us answer questions and helps us enter the debate in ways that we can't do right now as economists and trade policy analysts. So in particular, we've got some new issues related to workers, and we've got some new issues related to, say, multinational corporations and their profits. And while it gets wrapped up in the TPP debate, in what's basically a trade policy debate, probably these issues are more related to just underlying fundamentals of trade or underlying fundamentals of offshoring and global value chains. But since they've been wrapped up into the discussion about trade policy, I'll just list them here. Effect on workers. So unlike what you see in Japan, what Ms. Fukugawa was talking about earlier, unemployment and the effects on U.S. workers is a big deal in the United States, and it does drive a lot of the talk on the trade debate. And I think that the economic profession was kind of complacent. In the 1990s and the 2000s, we said that trade didn't have a whole lot to do with declining jobs in the United States, and I think that sentiment has very much been reassessed in recent years, particularly with some groundbreaking work by Autor, Dorn, and Hansen. We see that imports really have had an effect on U.S. manufacturing output and quite potentially manufacturing output in a lot of countries because we've seen manufacturing decline all over the world. So being upfront and thinking about whether this, connecting to the debate with this new information is important. Some places where the profession hasn't quite gotten to are unemployment. Typically, we've sort of taken the sense that trade deals have very little to say about unemployment. And that may actually be true, but some work on what the potential deals between trade and unemployment or trade deals and unemployment would be helpful if we want to answer people's fear, if we want to address people's fears and answer people's questions on that topic. Transition costs. If a worker is laid off, there's some really good work on how much it costs for them in their life if they have to get a new job or a new occupation or a new industry. The work says that it costs more than 1 year's wages. We have some really good work on the costs, but we haven't typically integrated that into discussions about trade and trade policy. And doing that would help a lot, I think. Profits. I'm asked a lot about profits, particularly as the share in GDP is increasing in the United States and I believe elsewhere. Does that have to do with trade? Does that have to do with offshoring? Profits as a share of value added are increasing quite rapidly in electronics, where there has been quite a bit of offshoring. Is that a smoking gun? I don't know. I don't know the work that would substantiate or deny that. Simon, you mentioned half a dozen areas. Exchange rates, currency manipulation. That's a hard thing to quantify. Treasury has looked into that, and with the IMF, but they haven't been particularly transparent about it. The methods they've talked more recently, they've given out new, clearer guidelines about whether you're a currency manipulator, but how much you are overvalued or undervalued, that's a tough area that's been not very well explained to people. Value-added taxes, I looked into this a couple years ago to see what the effect on value-added taxes on trade are. Not a lot out there. You look it up, there's very few papers on it, and they're not addressing this question. So if somebody wants to know if we reformed value-added taxes in the TPP, what that's going to do to trade, you'd have to do all new independent research to figure that out. IP on biologics, again, I'm not aware of any work in that area. Rules of origin, very hard to quantify. So All of these topics, these ones that are specific to TPP and some of the others that are more specific to the trade debate, need real careful thinking by the people in the room, by policy analysts, by trade economists, if we want to remain relevant and if we want to really answer the questions that are coming up. That's all. Thank you.